So we want to begin our conversation of the Gospel of Luke by talking a little bit about the context of the Gospel. And by that we mean several different things. We're talking about the authorship of the Gospel, the genre in which it was written, the audience to whom it was written. We're talking about the time and the situation. All of these are things that we want to consider here at the very beginning. So let's just start. Placing the time and the situation and the composition of the Gospel of Luke is more problematic than it may seem at first. When we're thinking about issues of dating the Gospel and where and when it was written, we only have internal evidence. In other words, we have only the written word itself to give us clues about where this Gospel may have been written and who may have written it. We have very, very little outside of the text to help us in this area. So, traditionally, Luke has been named as the author of this text, Luke supposedly being the friend of Paul, an idea that's given at least partial corroboration in the book of Acts, when that author, again believed to be Luke, uses the pronoun we, as if he or she was an eyewitness to the events which are being recorded. Now, most scholars or academics challenge this attribution, saying that much of the tone and the ideas and the purpose behind Luke and Acts would come a generation or so after Paul. On the other hand, it's impossible to rule out the idea that the author was an eyewitness to at least some of the events recorded here. And in fact, the author even confesses to relying on some of the sources in chapter 1, even while talking about being an eyewitness to these events. So none of this really tells us who the author is, but some facts and some suppositions can be made about this person. Number one, we know that the author was very well educated based on his or her use of the Greek style and Greek conventions. We know that the author was very likely Jewish because of the deep allusions to the Torah that are made throughout the text. This person was also very methodical, right? This person writes the way an historian would write. He is very thorough. And then this author also likes to use parables to illustrate key points. So there are some materials that are only found. Some of these parables are only found in the Gospel of Luke. For example, the story of the lost son, the story of the Good Samaritan, or the story of the rich fool, which tells us that these things are very specific to the author of the Gospel of Luke. Now, we are also uncertain about where this Gospel is written and to whom it was addressed. And traditional accounts vary on these points, and there is nothing definitive in the text to tell us. We do know that the audience obviously spoke Greek, so speaking to some Gentile audience with a background in the Scriptures. And it was written to those who already believe, as we can tell from the introduction of this Gospel. So the purpose is not to proselytize or to introduce Christian ideas into the text. This is being written to a group that already believes and has at least some knowledge of these events. As far as the style and the genre of the Gospel of Luke, we're looking at an historical narrative. So what Luke has done, he has taken many short stories, some of which were already well known, and he has managed to create a simple, single historical narrative of the history of Jesus' ministry and later on in Acts of the early church. So, given this narrative genre, we are going to be paying careful attention to where and when events happen to help us understand Luke's meaning. This will also be important as we consider how Luke portrays his characters. All of these things, the who, when, and where, are all very important in studying historical stories and historical narratives. And the genre of this gospel is a history, and we know that because when you look at the prologue, which we will very, very soon, you're going to be looking at how the prologue shows similar conventions to famous Greek histories. In the prologue, Luke talks about using other oral or written works as sources to validate his work, which is a very common convention in Greek history and Greek literature. And this idea of Luke's use of sources is also very important. We will talk about Luke's accuracy as an historian later on, but first we need to consider the sources that Luke is using in this account. And there are three basic sources here. Number one, Luke is using the Gospel of Mark, and historians widely accept that Mark is the first gospel that was written. Even though it's not the first listed in the New Testament, it is believed to be the first one that was composed, for reasons that we cannot get into here. Luke definitely uses the Gospel of Mark. There are certain materials that are only found in the Gospel of Luke, like we talked about earlier with the Good Samaritan and the story of the prodigal son. Materials and stories that are found only in the Gospel of Luke are referred to as L material. So you have the Gospel of Mark, you have this L material, and then you have this hypothetical source called the Q document. And the Q document is a document that is, as I mentioned, it's hypothetical. It's one that scholars and historians and academics believe existed at one time, but that has not survived over the years. And so what you have is, you have stories that are shared in Matthew and in Luke, but that are not found in the Gospel of Mark. And so historians have said, well, Mark did not have access to this document. Matthew and Luke, who were writing around the same time period, did have access to it, and they both have these stories about Jesus, about his followers, that are not found in other sources. So they have decided that there was very likely a source called the Q document, which both Matthew and Luke had access to and used to help as source material when they were compiling their Gospels. Now, Luke relies on Mark pretty extensively, although he does edit Mark in some ways. He certainly follows Mark more closely than Matthew does, although he does shy away from the large blocks of discourse material that you get in the Gospel of Mark, and he tends to tidy up Mark to make it a little more aesthetically pleasing, right? He kind of edits out the grammar, he works on the tone a little bit. So even though he follows Mark and uses it a lot, he does change it to suit his own style and his own purposes. Another interesting thing that you see here in the Gospel of Luke is Luke's attitude towards Rome. Luke has a much more positive attitude towards Gentiles and towards Roman officials than many of the other Gospels, and so that leads us to some speculation about his purposes. Is this an apology for Christians? In other words, is Luke writing to these to show that Rome is not so bad, right? That there are some positive aspects to being in the Roman Empire? Or is this an apology written for the Romans, to show the Romans that Christians are a harmless group, that they pose no threat to the empire, and that there should be cooperation there? Or perhaps it has a dual function, that Luke is writing to show outsiders that Christianity is a benevolent, peaceful group, while at the same time showing Christian insiders the proper interpretation of the gospel. Right? Is this a biography of Jesus, with this focus being on Christ and Christology and the life of his followers? So there is no scholarly consensus on exactly what the purpose or even what the genre of Luke is, beyond the fact that it is written as an historical narrative. So the position that I take is that this gospel is a biography, an historical biography that is written to give legitimacy to the early church and to the Jesus movement, to show the Romans that this is a harmless society that is able to coexist with the Roman government, and that it should be treated like any other of what were considered Jewish sects at the time. So the last thing to mention is the dating of the Gospel of Luke. Though it's impossible to know for certain, but most scholars believe that this Gospel was written somewhere around 80 to 100 AD. There are several internal references in the text to the destruction of the temple. The destruction of the temple happened in 70 AD when the Romans came in, laid siege to Jerusalem, and destroyed the temple. And so, for example, in Luke 13:35, you have what appears to be a reference to the destruction of the temple, which would have happened in the past. So that gives us a time frame sometime after 70 AD. Also, you have the works of Justin Martyr, the famous Christian writer who quotes Luke in the middle of the 1st century. So we have some time there, but the general consensus is that 80 to 100 AD is the time period that we're looking at for dating the Gospel of Luke. So those are some of the early issues that we need to contend with as we think about the Gospel and we prepare to read through the Gospel. So, thank you all very much.